Welcome to the first episode of Preserving the Republic, a dialogue. I'm Aaron, and just to start out, I just want to outline kind of the purpose of why I'm even starting this podcast in the first place. So my number one purpose for this podcast is to defend constitutional governments, and especially democratic governance, especially within the context of American democracy. Not only is it the purpose to promote American democracy, or democracy in general, but it's also to oppose authoritarianism in all of its forms. Hopefully it's a given that authoritarian governments in pretty much all their different forms that have arisen over the years are bad for the people in general. And it doesn't matter what political bend of the particular authoritarian government is. It can be left-wing, right-wing, or even no-wing. It's still bad for the people. And there's plenty of historical examples where authoritarian governments have hurt their people. Some of these historical examples include Hitler's Nazi Germany, Stalin's Soviet Union, Mao's China, even the Emperor of Japan around World War II. Some modern examples include Iran and North Korea. And so for all these governments, they've always hurt their people, especially in comparison to what modern democratic governments look like. There's a famous Churchill quote, and I think it really contextualizes the issue of the fight between authoritarianism and democracy. And I think it highlights how democracy isn't perfect. So Churchill said, quote, "Many forms of government have been tried and will be tried in this world of sin and woe. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time," end quote. Let me be clear, I think American democracy is flawed. In my opinion, it's not even the best form of democratic governance. But compared to the alternative, compared to authoritarian systems of government, it's the best that we have. And because American democracy is a democracy, we're able as citizens to implement changes to make it better. Changes for the better just aren't possible from a citizen perspective in authoritarian governments. I want to be clear that this show is not going to be a partisan hit show. Hopefully, this podcast will welcome curious people from all sorts of different political backgrounds who are interested in thoughtful, respectful conversations. I think it's going to be really important for me, but also my audience and the conversations that arise to be respectful and to understand that we are talking about ideas and that we respect one another because we all have different perspectives. And that the discussion of these different ideas is the only way that society improves over the long run. My goal is to create a warm, well-researched space where everyone can explore those ideas and push back against authoritarianism together. Hopefully, no matter what your political perspective is, left-wing, right-wing, or something different, we can all agree that authoritarianism is bad. And I want to make it very clear that people with different political views are not my enemy. In fact, I would argue that the greater danger lies with the people in power and the people with influence, whose goal is to divide the American people. There's a famous quote by a 19th century British historian. His name was Lord Acton. I think most people have heard this quote, at least part of the quote that really applies here. He said, quote, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Great men are almost always bad men, even when they exercise influence and not authority. Still more so when you superadd the tendency of the certainty of corruption by authority," end quote. I think the full context of that quote is really important because I think we've all heard the first part of that quote, that absolute power corrupts absolutely. But I think it's also an indicator, that second part of the quote, great men are almost always bad men, even when they exercise influence. It's really important to understand that part as well. It speaks to human nature, and I think it really applies. But even if someone only has influence or only limited authority, they're still corrupt. At the end of the day, they will still take actions that help themselves and are ultimately selfish and are ultimately corruptible. And at the end of the day, I think the people in power will always desire to increase their power in some form, which in its worst forms eventually leads to the authoritarian governments that I would argue are so harmful to society and the world. So before I dive into my own political views, because I think it's important for you as an audience to understand where I'm coming from, I just want to talk a little bit about my background and why I actually even care. And so over time, I've really become cynical when it comes to the American political process. And that's because I really do view most politicians in America to only do and say whatever it takes to get elected. At the end of the day, I don't think that they actually care about me, and I don't think that they actually care about the citizens that they're supposed to serve. And I think a huge influence of our politicians taking this perspective is corruption. I view corruption as a huge problem to the functioning of democracy. Corruption and money have distorted democracy, and it leads to ordinary citizens like myself to feel increasingly powerless. And when people feel powerless long enough, they either stop caring, so like myself, becoming more cynical, or they lash out. And so the origins of political corruption in America, it's always existed and always will, to one degree or another. But really was after 2010, when the Supreme Court ruled on Citizens United, that the floodgates really became opened to political spending in a way that they hadn't before. In that 2010 ruling, the Supreme Court ruled that government cannot limit independent political spending by corporations, unions, or nonprofit groups. And they ruled that that spending was considered to be free speech, and that these groups had free speech rights, the same as individuals. Let me reemphasize that this ruling did not start corruption. Again, corruption has existed in American democracy since the very beginning, but the ruling essentially accelerated and legalized the scale of corruption in America, and essentially legalized a degree of corruption in America. Of course, as I've highlighted, always been an issue before Citizens United. I'm actually currently reading a book about the Watergate scandal, and for those that aren't familiar, the Watergate scandal occurred in the 1970s, and it involved the Nixon administration's illegal surveillance, abuse of power, and secret political fundraising. And this is all connected to Richard Nixon's re-election campaign. And it was the cover-up of these activities that ultimately led to Nixon's resignation in 1974. What many people may not realize is that Nixon supported and signed the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971, which created disclosure rules and limits for political campaign finance. But the Nixon administration, while they supported and signed this legislation, also rushed to collect dirty money, in other words, illegal or undisclosed funds, before the deadline that the law set that required disclosure. And so the main takeaway from this is that even if a politician supports reforms, power always tries to outrun accountability. I want to talk about a politician that I have a very high respect for, or a former politician, I should say. He's since passed. But I have a lot of respect for John McCain, specifically as it relates to his efforts to reform campaign finance and address the issue of corruption in politics. In 2002, he helped pass the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2002, which aimed to reduce the influence of big money by banning unlimited soft money donations to political parties and limited political ads close to elections. And this was a real attempt to address the problem of corruption. But even this reform didn't fully address the problem, and future court rulings, including Citizens United, really weakened the impact of this law. I think at the end of the day, the reason why corruption is such a big problem is that it becomes easy to stop caring or participate in American democracy when big money donors, special interest groups, and big businesses are the only ones that influence politicians. And so why am I taking action now? Why aren't I just the cynic who decides to take a step back and not say anything? If what I say doesn't matter to politicians, why am I even making this podcast? Well, there are two moments that really changed my perspective, and it's the reason why I started caring deeply about preserving American democracy. That first moment occurred on January 6, 2021, when a violent mob stormed the U.S. Capitol in an effort to stop Congress from certifying the 2020 presidential elections. The attack disrupted core democratic processes and resulted in deaths, injuries, and hundreds of criminal convictions. And so this event really scared me in a way. I took for granted that even with the issues of corruption in American democracy, even with those flaws, January 6th really showed how fragile American democracy actually is. And despite all the flaws, American democracy is better than the alternative. In other words, I would prefer to have a corrupt system of American democracy as compared to an authoritarian government where citizens are mistreated to a much greater degree, and the outcomes for me and the people are far worse. I want to talk a little bit about my background growing up, and I think it helps contextualize why I care so much about the preservation of American democracy and why January 6th had such a huge impact to me. So as I was growing up, I actively participated in the Boy Scouts. In fact, one of my biggest regrets was not completing my Eagle Scout. But either way, I really developed a real love and pride for America. I would even say that I'm patriotic. I developed a love for America because of the system of governance that America has implemented, and the power of the people to implement changes is one of the biggest reasons why I love America so much. And January 6th really proved how easy it is for American democracy to fall. In my opinion, January 6th has posed the greatest risk to the fall of the American Republic in its current form since the Civil War. Now, in later episodes, I'll dive into greater details of what happened on January 6th. I found it was shocking to have an American president call on their supporters to basically do whatever it takes to stop the certification of an election. Now, that president called that election a sham, but all facts and evidence point to the fact that the 2020 election was legitimate. And there was no mass, widespread problem with election engineering or attempts to fiddle with the election results. Nothing enough to influence the results of the election. And I think with the re-election of Donald Trump, it's only a matter of time before there is a January 6th 2.0. If January 6th 2.0 happens, I feel there's a real risk American democracy will disappear. And it's a huge reason why I'm speaking up now. So a second reason for why I'm speaking up now is another moment. Maybe not a specific moment, but a accumulation of different moments. And that's the increase in political violence that the United States seems to have seen in the past decade. The United States has survived other eras of political violence. The most recent one that comes to mind was from the 1960s. The 1960s saw widespread political violence, including the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy, just to name a few specific examples. But there were also widespread riots, bombings, and violent clashes in America. The United States survived that era, but not without the great costs that come with widespread violence. As I mentioned earlier, it seems as though in the last decade, the United States has seen an increase in political violence. Some recent examples include, and these are examples, it's not limited to just these events, but there was the violent attack on state legislatures, including the murder of Minnesota Democratic State Senator John Hoffman and State Representative Melissa Hortman. We've seen the arson attack on Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro's home. There was the assassination attempt on Donald Trump in July 2024. And finally, we've seen the assassination of political activist Charlie Kirk. I want to be very clear. I condemn political violence in all its forms. But I think political violence is a leading indicator of democratic failure. Political violence signals people believe that their elected representatives don't listen, and that the people can't influence the political process in America peacefully. Political violence is what happens when people no longer believe peaceful participation matters. And this is one reason why addressing the issue of corruption is so important. Because corruption at its root is one of the reasons why people don't feel that their beliefs matter to their elected representatives. I created this podcast to address the rise of authoritarianism in the United States, and my number one priority is to stop this authoritarianism movement. But creating a democracy where everyone feels heard is really the next step. If we want less violence, we need more democracy, not just in theory, but in practice. A system where people actually believe their voices matter. So just moving on, I think it's really important for me to kind of outline my own political perspectives and my own political views. As much as I would try to claim to be unbiased, I actually know that that's absolutely impossible to do. In fact, I would say that anyone that argues that they are unbiased, they're just simply lying to themselves and others. I'd rather be upfront about my own political views, because that allows you as an audience to make judgments about my biases and helps you understand how to interpret how I present this podcast. And so just a little bit of background about myself, some of my voting history. Based on my voting history, I think that many would classify myself as a liberal. I voted for the Democratic nominee for president in all but one of the presidential elections since Obama in 2008. And of that one presidential election in which I voted for a non-Democrat, I voted third party. And so my own ideological evolution has really shifted over time. And I like to think that as I'm introduced to new ideas or new facts, that I'm able to shift my opinions. So I started out as a very strong libertarian, and over time I kind of shifted from that libertarian mindset to more of a hardened liberal Democrat. And today I would say I'm more of a left-wing pragmatist. And so at its root, I still hold a very deep undercurrent of libertarian philosophy in the sense that I generally think individuals are best off making decisions for themselves and should be pretty much left alone to live life as they see fit. I'm also a really strong supporter of individual rights and civil liberties. That's very important to me. Obviously, I've shifted my views over time, and even though I still have that strong undercurrent of supporting personal liberties, as I shifted over time, I understand that state action is sometimes required when people's choices harm other people. And that's not just at the individual level, but it can also be at the aggregate. A really good example of this is economic policies. I also recognize that state power is not the only thing that overrides individual liberties. And so I think often, historically and even today, that consolidated corporate and business power can often have similar impacts as oppression from the state. Granted, I would recognize that corporate powers generally don't set up authoritarian, or don't directly run, at least, authoritarian governments, but they still can consolidate power and limit the freedom of individuals. So that's just a bit about background about my own political views, but let's define what political views actually are. What does it mean to have a political view? I mean, besides just taking a stance on a specific political issue and supporting or opposing specific government actions, I think that political views really are derived at a deeper level than just that. I think the question is, where do they come from? I'm not a political scientist, but I think there's a few different areas where political views are derived for people. I think the first is really a person's values. In other words, what does a person deeply care about? And it's not just what they care about at a personal level, but it's also what do they care about at a family level and a societal level. Another aspect that influences political views is a person's personal experiences. I think that people's personal experiences heavily shape the way they view the world and in turn influences a person's political views. For example, a person who grows up in rural poverty is going to have an extremely different experience compared to someone raised by wealthy Ivy League educated parents. And in turn, both of these people are most likely going to have vastly different political views. Another aspect that influences people's political views is how people understand human nature. And what I mean by this is, to what degree do people think that people are naturally good or evil? And under what circumstances do people think that others, or humanity, are influenced to do good versus bad? And then finally, I think that people's understanding of morality is the final main factor that influences the development of people's political views. It's not just the definition of morality, but it's also where do people think morality comes from and what influences that morality, whether that be religion, society, etc. I also think it's important to understand that political views are generally nuanced for most people. I know for myself that my political views are nuanced. No one party has policies or promotes ideas that 100% align with my own viewpoints. And I think it's safe to say that for the vast majority of people, the same is also true. Even for people who are on the far left or on the far right who consistently vote for one party or another, they're not generally going to be aligned 100% with one party or the other. I think that anyone that pays attention to politics is probably familiar with the classic left-right paradigm, but I think that's an oversimplification. Maybe if you're a political junkie, you're even familiar with the Political Compass online quiz that basically breaks down political views into two different axes instead of one, namely one for personal liberties and one for economic perspectives. Based on my research, and again, I'm not a political scientist, but it seems that most political views can be broken down into even more additional categories instead of just two. And people can have different perspectives on all these different categories, whether or not the political parties align with their views or not. And so through my research, I found what is called the multidimensional model. And this breaks down political views into 4 different categories. We've already talked about 2. The first is economic, and so how much you would prefer to allow the state to intervene on behalf of people versus non-interventionism from an economic perspective. The second is authoritarianism versus liberty, how much individual rights and liberties people should have versus how much a government should be able to override those rights for the good of the masses. The third category is social and cultural, and so this would include things as vast as the classic social issues in America, abortion, gay rights. It can also influence a person's views on religion and the role of religion in government and society. And then finally, the fourth category of the multidimensional model includes foreign policy. And so this is basically an argument between globalism, and so how much you think that a country and its leaders should interact at a global scale or address issues from a global, worldwide perspective, versus nationalism, which is to address issues from an individual country's perspective and to essentially fight for the issues that promote a better country, even if it harms or demises other countries or peoples in the world. Now, the multiple-dimensional model breaks it down into these 4 different issues, but I'm sure that there are essentially infinite number of different other categories that influences political views. I just think the overriding takeaway is that political views are shaped in a multitude of different ways. And because of that, I don't think that political views are very useful. Because of the multidimensional ways that political views are influenced, political views really aren't defined by labels or party affiliation. At least they aren't for me. I think that people's views shift depending on the issue at hand and what's most important to them. I think the importance of an issue really heavily influences political behavior and support for a party. For example, a person might have a very left-leaning view, but if they define themselves as being pro-life and their most important issue is abortion, it doesn't matter that they are heavily left-wing on all these other issues. They may consistently vote and affiliate with Republicans in the United States based on that single issue. In short, I think that it's important to understand that political views are far more complex than the labels we assign ourselves via political parties. I think it's important to understand where the rise of Trump actually came from. Why was he able to garner enough support from the American people to be elected to president twice? In my opinion, there are a few different major factors that led to the rise of Trump. But before digging into those factors, I want to talk about my own personal experience that is, in my opinion, highly relevant to this discussion. For several years, I lived in rural Appalachia. By virtue of my accent, I think it's obvious that I'm not originally from the area, and I think it would be disingenuous for me to claim to be Appalachian. I think that people who were born and raised in the area have a much better understanding of their own culture, and I've just been allowed to get a little glimpse of understanding the culture there. I don't know the exact statistics, but I would wager a guess that somewhere around 80 to 90% of the people of Appalachia support Donald Trump. And this mirrors widespread support that Trump has from rural America. That's Trump's baseline of support. So why do people in rural America support Trump? In my opinion, there are 3 major factors. First is economic disparity. Coal and steel are king in Appalachia, or at least they were. These titans of industry supported the area with good-paying jobs for decades and provided the raw resources necessary to drive industrialization and widespread economic growth throughout the United States. Manufacturing traditionally has played a huge role in the economic dominance of the United States, and it wasn't unusual for a small town's entire economic prosperity to depend upon a single factory, providing employment to 90% or more of a town's population. Overall, manufacturing, coal, and steel production has been on the decline within the US for decades. People impacted by the overall decline blame environmental regulations, immigration, and free trade. All 3 are issues Trump campaigns on and has implemented major policies to address as president. The second factor is corrupt politicians and a general distrust of major institutions and of the elite. I've already discussed the problems and dangers corruption plays in American democracy. And I think it's blatantly obvious that both parties are at the mercy of their financial donors. Trump has used his status as a billionaire to maintain his independence from this donor class. In later episodes, I plan to show how Trump is more corrupt, not less. But the perception that he doesn't rely on donations the same way that other politicians do results in the support of many of these Americans. Donald Trump even directly confronted this issue of corruption during a 2016 debate with Hillary Clinton. During the debate, Clinton claimed Trump avoided paying federal taxes by using loopholes. And Trump responded by arguing that he was being smart to reduce his tax burden, using a system that was set up by politicians corrupted by the wealthy elite. Trump specifically called out Clinton for her own corruption and for supporting tax policies that benefited her wealthy donors. During the debate, Trump claimed, given his experiences with his own taxes, that he could fix the problems with the tax system and the corruption that has influenced it. Given this corruption, distrust of the elites and major institutions and powerful people has come about because the elites have ignored the problems of the people in rural America. Until Trump, the economic disparity of rural America was completely ignored by both sides of the political aisle. As an example, since the days of Bill Clinton, the left and the right have both supported free trade. The classic argument went that as economies shifted, workers would retrain to thrive in new industries. I believe free trade is good, and it's one of the core ways to promote overall economic prosperity. But the idea that a worker who has worked in the same field for 10 or 15 years will retrain and easily adapt to a new industry and career is patently ridiculous. Mainstream politicians have ignored the fact that there are winners and losers with free trade, and Trump has taken advantage of that through his rhetoric and his policies. Elites and the institutions they support are seen by rural America to only support others that would increase their own power and wealth. In a word, the elites don't care about the everyday rural Americans who are hurting. Finally, the issue of cultural displacement and the loss of a shared identity plays a key role in rural American support for Donald Trump. Personally, I can speak to Appalachia culture, which I think can generally be applied to rural American culture, and there are so many different positive traits that it encompasses. Some of these traits of the culture include a strong sense of place. Families often live on the same land for generations. There's no such thing as moving to another location simply just to get another job. You stay where you are, and it promotes a strong sense of place. And this leads into another positive trait of the culture, in that rural Americans tend to have a strong sense of community. People rally and support each other, especially when times are tough. People can depend on their neighbors. Another positive quality is a strong work ethic, but people also have a sense of control over their own individual destiny. Tied into this aspect of the culture is self-reliance, but it doesn't just apply to working hard within the workforce, but it also includes other aspects like gardening, canning, fishing, and hunting. An additional positive quality is religion, specifically Christianity. On this podcast, I'm not going to debate religion or theology, but there is no doubt churches have played a central role in supporting small-town communities and serves as a central place where everyone in a small town can come together. Of course, not everything about rural American culture is positive. There are certainly racial undertones and a support for a shared white identity. But generally speaking, I think that there are positives about the culture. There is no doubt that the culture of America is rapidly changing. And I think that people in rural America fear losing the best aspects of their culture to this change. Trump directly speaks to these fears. All three of these factors highlight real problems and concerns the people of rural America face. Mainstream politicians have largely ignored these core issues, while Trump has embraced them. I want to emphasize that I think politicians should speak to these issues in the same way that Trump has. Now, politicians have a diversity of ideas on how to address these concerns, but at the end of the day, Trump is really the only one who is speaking to these issues. These concerns are not illegitimate. I don't reject the concerns that rural Americans face and are concerned with. What I reject is the authoritarian solution to these problems. Next, I just want to address the elephant in the room. I'm starting this podcast as a direct response to Donald Trump's increasingly fascist shift to the right. And I think there's no question that Trump is marching towards fascism. To be clear, I don't think that all Republicans are fascists, nor are all Trump supporters fascists. I don't even think that everyone in the Trump administration is a fascist. But I think it's clear that Trump poses a clear and present danger to democracy. His actions and his rhetoric have really shown that even if he's not an authoritarian leader today, he wants to be. Next, I want to talk about why I even care. Well, really, why I'm so concerned about the fall of American democracy. Obviously, American democracy has successfully survived for over 200 years. So why am I so concerned? Well, the fact is, even though the United States has managed to maintain its democracy for a relatively long period of time, other democracies have failed in the past, and there's no reason why the United States can't also fall to authoritarianism and fascism over time. So there's a few different examples I want to talk about, but the first, I think probably the most common one to talk about when it comes to democracies failing, comes from pre-World War II Germany, the Weimar Republic. So the Weimar Republic basically arose after World War I in Germany, and it was a parliamentary democratic government that lasted for about a decade until Hitler took power. And so over this decade where Germany had a functioning democratic government, there was a general increase in personal freedom. And so this included aspects like sexual orientation, women's rights, and even expanded rights to minority Jews. During the same period, there was general political instability still, and there was political violence, which include the failed coup by Hitler in 1923. Hyperinflation and then the Great Depression led to difficulties forming a functioning government due to the nature of parliamentary democratic systems. Speaking to my American listeners, parliamentary democracies are proportional and allocate legislative power based on the percentage of vote a party gets. And often a single party doesn't win a majority of the votes and have to form coalitions to have a functioning government. And often this leads to dysfunctional governments. Just imagine what the US would be like if Republicans won 35% of the vote and Democrats won 25% of the vote, and that in order to have a functioning government, the Democrats and Republicans had to form a coalition government. Those types of things often happen under parliamentary democratic systems. Eventually, the Nazis gained power in parliament, which led to Hitler seizing power in 1933. Hitler used emergency powers granted to the Chancellor under their constitution to effectively dissolve democracy. The overall rise and fall of German democracy in this era only took 14 years. Comparing to the United States to Germany of that time, there are some key differences and similarities I want to talk about. The first key difference is that the economic conditions in Germany were far worse compared to the United States, previous to Trump's rise. Inflation in the post-COVID era peaked at 9.1% in the United States, and is currently closer to 3%. This contrasts with the situation in Germany, where hyperinflation caused prices to double every 3 to 4 days. Additionally, Germany's democracy only lasted 14 years, and therefore was especially young, and operated in a major unstable political environment. American democracy is long-standing and has strong institutional memory. Finally, the German Constitution explicitly allowed for emergency actions by the Chancellor to overrule democratic governance. The US does not grant the same power to the president, and the separation of powers act as one prevention tool to stop the president from becoming dictator. The US also has some similarities to what happened in Germany. Currently, the US is facing major economic problems and upheaval. Even if we aren't facing the same type of economic decline, the reality is that the economy is rapidly shifting, and certain classes of people are being left behind. Trump rose to power highlighting the plight of blue-collar workers, and similar upheaval is likely if the promise of AI turns out to work as well as predicted. In addition, the US is seeing heightened partisan polarization. Though we don't see quite the same level of polarization as compared to Germany, we are seeing a rise of political violence. Finally, rising rhetoric that attacks democratic institutions is occurring in the United States, and this includes Trump's attacks on legitimate election outcomes and his attacks on the press. A second example of democracies falling to authoritarianism, and this is a more recent example, is that of the example of Hungary, which has seen a steady shift from democracy to authoritarianism. Technically today Hungary is still a democracy, but they have heavy authoritarian leanings. The current Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, got his start as a pro-democracy advocate in the 1980s. He was first elected minister in 1998 under a conservative populist message. He later lost elections in 2002 and 2006, but was re-elected in 2010 in the aftermath of the worldwide financial crisis. In 2020, Orban was given emergency power to rule independently from the legislature in response to COVID-19, and despite the intention of those powers being temporary, Orban continues to use these emergency powers to rule Hungary today. Since 2010, there has been a steady reduction of civil rights and other aspects of democratic governance. Examples of this include a general increase of corruption, criminal law is no longer enforced independently, which has led to bribery. Orban has engaged in court stuffing and changed the constitution in Hungary to reduce judicial authority. Freedom of the press, speech, and religion are no longer protected by the government of Hungary. Police have been used to attack dissenters. Pro-Orban media outlets get direct support from the government, and government media promote Orban's political party. And finally, there have been changes to voting laws that favor Orban's political party. Generally, there has been a steady decline towards authoritarianism, but Hungary does still hold elections. So what are some core differences in Hungary compared to the United States? One is that the US still has a functioning opposition party. In Hungary, election law changes have made it virtually impossible for the opposition to win. To be fair, an uptick in gerrymandering could steadily change this current reality in the United States. But elections are also run by the states, not the federal government, making this process slow and hard to do from a national level. Overall, although Trump is attempting to shift election laws to be favorable to him, it hasn't happened to the same extent as compared to what has happened in Hungary. Second, attacks on democratic norms have actually happened quicker under the Trump administration. He has only been in power for about 1 year, and yet he has done a lot to consolidate power within the executive branch. To be fair, the extent of this shift is not as strong as it has been in Hungary, but at the same time, it's only been a year, and Trump still has 3 more years in his term left. Finally, another difference is that Trump's attacks on the courts up until this point have been mostly indirect, versus in Hungary, attacks on the courts have been direct, and Hungary's leader directly controls the judiciary for all intents and purposes. Some similarities between Hungary and the United States includes the increase in executive power and a reduction in power to the legislature and judicial branches. To be clear, Hungary is a little bit different because they do have a parliamentary system, and so the legislature and executive branch are really intertwined by definition, but you still see this increase in power to the president and the executive branch for all intents and purposes. In addition, the overall decline in democracy, as I mentioned, is not as extreme as what has happened in Hungary. For now, we still have a constitution and other institutions that are independent from Trump, protecting democracy. Additionally, there have been widespread attacks on the free press by Trump, which includes him filing lawsuits and includes cutting funding to public broadcasting. Public broadcasting that I think we can all agree leans left, but does a pretty good job of reporting the news accurately. In other words, their biases have more to do with the stories that they report than the accuracy of the reporting. And then finally, the United States is seeing an increase in corruption under Trump's second term. I'm not going to talk about the details here, but I will dive into the details in later podcasts. The final country I want to talk about is Turkey. Just for some background about Turkey, their current authoritarian leader is Erdogan, and he's ruled Turkey for over 2 decades. Similar to Hungary, Turkey is still technically a democracy, but the government operates in an authoritarian fashion, and a general reduction of democracy has come steadily through new laws and other government action. Just for some baseline history of Turkey, Turkey held its first democratic elections in 1950, but Turkey, over time, has had many coups, including coups in 1960, 1971, 1980, and 1997, where democratically elected governments were overruled. In general, the military has had a strong influence over the government of Turkey, and although the coups stopped after Erdogan took power in 2002, where his party actually opposed military influence, this shifted over time, and Erdogan supported a failed coup in 2016. which resulted in widespread firing or arrests of non-loyal government workers, including judges, teachers, and military leaders. Journalists were also arrested and independent media shut down. Really, the backslide away from democracy in Turkey started in 2013, which included government crackdowns on protesters. In 2019, opposition leader Imamoglu, who was the mayor of Istanbul, was arrested, and his mayoral election win was invalidated. This opposition leader was later allowed to run and won the mayoral election in Istanbul, but in 2025, he was again arrested and is currently in jail facing terrorism and corruption charges. It's important to note that the judiciary in Turkey is no longer independent and makes rulings in favor of Erdogan and his ruling party. So what are some similarities between Turkey and the United States? Trump and Erdogan are both populist leaders, and this really signals how populism, ironically, can lead to the fall of democracy. Erdogan has also taken a particularly nationalist stance when it comes to economic issues, and has blamed the West for poor economic conditions. Trump also takes a similar economic nationalist stand. And finally, both countries have seen strong polarization and hyperpartisanship. So what are some of the core differences between Turkey and the United States today? The US still has a separation of powers with independent judiciary and legislative branches. Turkey does not. To be clear, Trump has attacked the courts and has blatantly ignored court orders, but for now, judicial branch of government in the United States is still independent. Second, despite Trump's widespread attacks on the media, the escalation of attacks on journalism in the United States is not at the same level as what happened in Turkey. There have been no widespread arrests of independent journalists. And finally, political opposition in the United States is still able to operate effectively without much challenge from the current government in the United States. And this is similar to what I talked about with Hungary. Hopefully it can be understood by covering these three examples of democratic governance falling or shifting towards authoritarianism that you could see why I'm concerned. There are similarities between the United States and these three historical or current examples, but the United States could easily fall in a similar way, and I see a similar trajectory happening under the Trump administration. I'm going to outline 14 different traits that Trump emulates that are all associated with fascism. And as I was doing research for this podcast, I was kind of surprised that Trump really emphasizes every single one of these 14 traits. I think it's also important for me to be clear that even though I'm talking about Trump and my opposition to his fascist shift and tendencies, that the danger doesn't just come from the right. In the context of American democracy, I don't see another political leader with heavy authoritarian tendencies coming from the left. In fact, even the furthest left politician in the United States, which I think most people could agree that Bernie Sanders probably fits that profile, I don't see him arguing for authoritarianism or increased authoritarian power. But just because he's not arguing for that today doesn't mean that he or future leaders who are far left won't make that argument from the left wing. And I could easily see a leader like that coming from the left wing, especially using left-wing populism in a similar way that Trump has used right-wing populism. I could see a leader like that and movement easily coming to the forefront in politics within the United States. And so hopefully, after I've kind of gone over the issues of fascism, the traits of fascism, and how Trump emulates them, and how ultimately we should oppose them, I'm hoping to cover the dangers of left-wing authoritarianism as well in the future. What is authoritarianism anyways? So just looking at the word itself, just breaking it into its parts. The first part is authority, and so in this context, it's a person or organization having power or control. And typically the power is associated with one person or a small group of people, and the authority demands unquestioning submission. Tarian is a derivative of totalitarian, which is a system of government that is centralized and dictatorial and requires complete subservience to the state. The regime uses various levels of control and often employs state-controlled media, propaganda, and surveillance to maintain its power and suppress. And finally, ism. This denotes a system of beliefs and practices. So in this case, it's a political philosophy that values order and control over personal freedom and individual rights. There are several core aspects of authoritarianism. of which the first is a concentration of power. And so authority is centralized in a single leader, ruling class, or small group of decision makers. They exercise power with little accountability. I think that last part, a lack of accountability, is key. The citizens have no way to reject the leaders or fight for new policies that would help their country move in a different direction. The citizens don't even have the power to fight against a regime, to move the country in a direction that would lead to poor outcomes. They simply have no power because the leader has all control. Another aspect of authoritarianism is limited political pluralism. Political competition is restricted. Opposition parties, interest groups, and dissenting voices are constrained, co-opted, or suppressed. Really, dissent is impossible. All decisions are ultimately made by leaders or by the elite, and they're unilateral. Even if the citizens recognize the decisions as ultimately being harmful, it does not matter. Another aspect of authoritarianism is weak or manipulated democratic institutions. Institutions like legislatures, courts, and elections may exist, but they lack real power or independence. Elections are often non-competitive or controlled to maintain power. Notably, leaders of authoritarian governments fear giving any power at all to the people. I think it's also really important to note that they may pretend to have some form of democracy, when in reality, democracy doesn't exist, and the leader will continue to exert control and have power no matter what the people think. Another aspect of authoritarianism is the suppression of dissent and civil liberties. And so criticism of the regime and independent voices like media, civil society, and activists are restricted, censored, intimidated, or punished. Authoritarian systems often curtail basic freedoms like speech, press, assembly, and association. I think a key aspect of this is that the strong leader stops criticism as a way to maintain their power. And that seems to be a core theme within authoritarianism, is that all of these aspects help the leader maintain their power. Another aspect of authoritarianism is controlled or manipulated information. State or regime-aligned actors dominate media and information channels. Independent reporting is restricted, and narratives are shaped to favor power consolidation. Basically, in essence, all information is controlled by the state, and independent journalism that's needed to keep a government accountable isn't even allowed to exist. And so often under authoritarian regimes, the people aren't even informed well enough to know what's actually happening and would not even be able to formulate an opinion or to get involved in activism to promote better policies or to oppose a regime. Moving on to the next aspect of authoritarianism, there's a lack of rule of law and accountability. The legal system is weak, biased, or subject to manipulation. Laws protect the regime and its leaders rather than citizens. It restricts citizens' rights, and checks and balances are undermined. Basically, leaders always come first, and they will never be held accountable, even if they commit grievous crimes. Moving on, another aspect of authoritarianism is minimal political mobilization. So rather than broad engagement in participatory politics, political activity is limited, controlled, or discouraged. Citizens are often kept passive and disempowered. Authoritarianism is inherently undemocratic and leads to the suppression of civil liberties. If citizens were given rights, it would risk undermining the strongman leader and ultimately would reduce their power. And the final trait of authoritarian governments is that legitimacy is based on performance or emotion rather than democratic consent. Support for the regime is often cultivated through appeals to stability, fear of disorder, nationalism, or crisis response, rather than free electoral choices. Again, it's another way for leaders to exert soft power control of the people. And a strong leader is often posed as the only way to address the problems that the leader speaks to, whether those problems actually exist in reality or are completely imagined. And it helps the leader to maintain their power as they use the charisma to convince the people to support them. Even if they only get a subset of the people to support them, that's all they need. At the end of the day, authoritarianism is a subset of fascism. So fascism is a version of authoritarianism. And so in my future podcast, I'll do a deep dive into the 14 different traits of fascism that were first outlined by Lawrence Britt. And so I'll speak to them here, but I'll do a deep dive in later episodes, especially with concerns to how Trump emphasizes each of these traits. 1, powerful and continuing nationalism. 2, disdain for the recognition of human rights. 3, identification of enemies and scapegoats as a unifying cause. 4, supremacy of the military. 5, rampant sexism. 6, controlled mass media. 7, obsession with national security. 8. Religion and government are intertwined. 9. Corporate power is protected. 10. Labor power is suppressed. 11. Disdain for intellectuals and the arts. 12. Obsession with crime and punishment. 13. Rampant cronyism and corruption. And finally, 14. Fraudulent elections. And so as I explore all 14 of these topics in future episodes, I'll argue that Trump emphasizes and aligns with every single one of these 14 character traits. Something I think is important to keep in mind is that fascism and authoritarianism can be popular, and so citizens can support a strong leader who promises to fix problems, and can even be willing to give up their rights, to cede their power to a strongman leader in order to solve these problems. It's perceived that the authoritarian leader is the only one that can solve these problems, and they can only be solved if this leader has ultimate control and power. Now, this doesn't mean that citizens always support authoritarianism or fascism, and in fact, if they always did, then the policies of a fascist leader or authoritarian leader could be implemented within a democracy. But often, authoritarianism and fascism arises with the popular support of the people. Again, even if it's not a majority, there is a substantial portion of the population that supports it. I think from an individual level, fascism is really similar to an abusive relationship. Now, domestic violence is complicated, and I'm definitely not an expert, but it seems to me that abusive relationships seem to fit a pattern. First comes love bombing. Everything is grand and wonderful in the beginning of a relationship. The abuser gives grand gifts, also provides compliments to the victim. They help make the victim feel good. Then, the abuser slowly starts to reveal their true colors. The abuser engages in gaslighting. Steadily over time, the abuser manipulates their victim to exert control and power. They become violent, and this is a steady process over time that escalates slowly. At the end stage, an abuser has complete control over their victim. It becomes almost impossible for the victim to assert themselves and leave the relationship. If a victim does leave, it often comes at a grave cost, such as facing extreme violence. I would also compare fascism and authoritarianism to a cult. So some aspects of a cult that apply to fascism and authoritarianism in general are that first, leaders are worshipped, idolized, and are seen as people that can do no harm. Second, criticism is banned and thought control is implemented. Third, only leaders can save the people. Fourth, us versus them narratives arise. All people are expected to support their leader and to fight against enemies who are outsiders or the opposition that are causing all the problems. Fifth, information control. Only information that points leadership in a positive light is allowed to exist. And finally, there are charismatic, strong-arm leaders. To wrap up this episode, I want to emphasize that the loss of democracy is not inevitable. But if we, as citizens, are passive, democratic failure is far more likely. Democracy will only survive when ordinary people are willing to defend it. Democracy has real flaws. Many people feel unheard, and corruption has eroded trust in representative government. Strongman leaders like Trump present themselves as people who have the solutions to these failures of democracy. But history shows that authoritarianism is not the cure for democratic breakdown. Instead, it only accelerates those problems. This podcast isn't about demonizing our neighbors or claiming one political party has all the answers. The real danger arises when power becomes unaccountable, when loyalty is valued over truth, and when fear replaces participation. Ultimately, that's how free societies slowly surrender what they once took for granted. I'm not here to tell you what to think. Open debate and competing ideas are signs of a healthy democracy. But we must recognize the warning signs and stop fascism before it's too late. I invite you to join me on this journey, not just to oppose fascism, but to fight for a stronger, more accountable democracy. In the next episode, I'll begin walking through and detailing the 14 characteristics of fascism, and I'll examine how the Trump administration reflects them. Until then, thank you for listening, and I hope you'll continue this journey with me into the future.